Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. Welcome to the penultimate episode of The Night Sky. I'm joined today by my co host, Andrew Gay. We are going to visit about our experience in doing both hosting and producing the Night Sky podcast. First, we were honored with a Communicator Award for a top podcast in science, so we were both thrilled about that. But what really wanted to do today was talk about some of the guests that we've had on and what we really both learned in this experience. I think it's fair to say we were fairly neophyte in our knowledge of eclipses prior to this podcast, even though two were coming to Kerrville when we started. And it's just been a journey of exploration and learning for me with a lot of joy mixed in and some great stories. Andrew, what are your thoughts about this penultimate episode?
Yeah, so I'm excited to sit in on this with you, Tom, and discuss some of what we've learned just because I think I've shared this over the course of us recording some of these episodes, that I had been exposed to amateur astronomy in my mid to late 20s, and it hit me and landed on me a little bit differently than it did maybe when I was younger. I had gone to planetariums. I had been exposed to some of the basic material that you get exposed to when you're talking about astronomy just through formal education. But man, it was a different experience as far as kind of being exposed to that at a little bit older age where I cared about it more. I looked at it more as the potential to be a hobby. And I was educated by some folks that kind of knew that were into that hobby themselves, and they were able to educate me and get me started. And so by the time we got to the point where we started this podcast, I was just overly thrilled to be a part of it. So first off, thank you for including me in this project. It's been great. My initial thoughts were that I've grown and I've learned a lot from not just the scientific standpoint, but also from the standpoint of just talking to local community members and other people that share this kind of passion that I now have for the night sky. So what about yourself?
We started this podcast with my good friend Ben Lockwood, and Ben has two PhDs, one of which is in astrophysics, and he really set the tone, I thought, Andrew, for the entire series. He brought a globe, he brought a model of the solar system, he brought a model of the sun and the moon, and he demonstrated how all of this is going to occur literally on the podcast. And it was a great way for us to get introduced to the science of a total eclipse and really how a scientist would look at it. And I asked Ben a question that I ask literally everyone we interviewed in this podcast series. And I was like, Ben, when did you fall in love with the night sky? And his answer was perfect. He had a teacher in the third grade and he was 8 years old. And she basically said, look at the sky. And he fell in love with it at that point, all the way through, like I said, to getting his PhD. So that really, I thought, set the tone for the podcast series. But it wasn't just the scientists. We had a couple of local business leaders. Leslie Jones and Karen Taylor talked about the economic impact of the eclipse on Kerrville and Kirk County. There's been numbers between 125 to 500,000 people thrown around that are coming to either Kerrville or Kirk County for the eclipse, and what that means in terms of traffic, what that means in terms of supplies, what that means in terms of just physically people who will be here, what it means for the businesses here. So there was really a lot for us to talk about. And then, as you said, there's some very passionate people around eclipses. And we had Jeff Stone, we have Loretta Hidalgo Whitesides, and they are true eclipse chasers.
Eclipse and space astronomy evangelists.
Exactly. And Jeff Stone moved here to see the eclipse, literally. And Loretta does online classes around eclipses. She's got a great Star Wars space camp for kids to teach them leadership and business and ethical lessons based on Star Wars. And she calls herself the Eclipse Evangelist. She's a former NASA employee, as is Jeff. And there's going to be a huge NASA presence here. I really you just can't sit in the same room with those people and not become infected with their enthusiasm. They're both so great. What about some of the guest highlights for you?
Yeah, and I think starting with Jeff and Loretta, I think those 2 were just absolute treats for me. I didn't realize that, especially talking to Loretta, I didn't realize that there was such a large space community, if you will, that she was so plugged into and well in tuned with, and the stories she told. She's written a book, very well achieved, and has some accomplishments out there that are impressive. And it was just eye opening to me to be able to talk to someone like that right here in our backyard that was visiting here and was excited for this eclipse to take place right here in our backyard. And it was that was very eye opening to me. So that was probably one of my favorite recordings. I felt like I got a lot out of that. But also Jeff. I think that Jeff was that was I think the second episode that we did. That was also very eye-opening for me to hear his stories about working with NASA back in the day before technology is what a lot of us think about technology being today. Just back when I remember him describing, was it the mail room or whatever room that it was almost like they were in this basement and you had these chutes and that's how they sent correspondence around their to their peers. Anyway, that was great. So those 2 were probably the highlights for me. I really enjoyed recording those episodes. I got a lot out of it. I learned a lot just from talking to those 2 individuals. But also the other ones, I think, as far as like you hit on preparedness, talking to Leslie Jones and Karen Taylor and some of the leaders in our local community about what to expect for the upcoming eclipse, especially the one that's about to happen in the next 2 weeks. We saw the one in October. It was a great experience. We can talk about that a little bit more in just a minute if you want, but to hear their take on what to expect and how to be prepared for the one in April, it was very interesting to me, and I think that there's an underlying pattern there where we're not really sure what's gonna happen in a couple of weeks. Like, it could be an extra 20,000 people, but it could be an extra 200,000. Roads could flow very smooth and everybody get in and out fine and no issues, but it also could get backstopped and things not work out too well and traffic backed up for miles and the resources running low. We just don't know what to expect. I don't think that hopefully does not taint our experience as long as we have clear skies that day and we're able to enjoy the experience as it happens. Hopefully, none of that stuff gets in the way. But it's very interesting to hear how the different perspectives from our local leaders about how to prepare for something that they're not quite sure this is going to play out, how it's going to play out.
Let me pick up on one of the points you talked about, which was the different experiences at different eclipses. And Loretta was the first person to talk about this in our podcast series, but I also talked to a guy named Mike Zeller. And Mike has been to every eclipse since 1990. And as he said, they're all different.
Fascinating episode. I think
And
it's the most recent episode
right.
too.
And it's because the relationship of where you're watching it to the sun is different. And to the moon is different, whether you're in West Africa, whether you're in the hill country of West Texas, Spain, South America, Mexico, it's all gonna be different. And so you're right, you have no understanding of what it will be like until you're in it, no matter how many you've been to. I did learn a new word throughout this podcast series, totality, and it is the length of totality of darkness, which is what every eclipse chaser wants. They want the longest length of totality possible, and I think we're scheduled for 4 minutes and 12 seconds of totality, that's total darkness, and that is on the long end or the high end of a total eclipse, so that's gonna make this special with the big caveat of clear skies.
Big caveat. We're keeping our fingers crossed on that.
Well,
So
tell us about your experience for the annular eclipse.
I and my wife and myself and my sister-in-law were at our house, and I think one of the amplifying features for that experience was the fact that we were at home and that we were able to just walk out onto our back porch and have everything set up the way that we want. I think we were listening to music, we were just hanging out, the weather was beautiful. So we got to set the stage, if you will, for the experience on our own accord. It was at our house. We were on our back porch. I think my neighbors were doing the same thing. And because everybody could hear everybody else, the wows and the ahs, and as it was happening. And the one thing that really stuck with me, and I can still vividly remember it, it was the shadows, the eclipse shadows. I'd never seen those before. I think I had seen a picture online maybe before, but in the middle of it all happening, I forgot about that. I wasn't really thinking about that. We were just watching it and trying to enjoy the experience. And I looked down and there's this big oak tree that sits like 20, 50 feet from our house, but it's got to be 200, 300 years old. It's enormous and has these big sprawling branches, just enough that part of one of the branches coming off is in front of our back porch, and the sun was at an angle where a lot of the sunlight was coming through there. And so the dappled sunlight that hit the ground right next to us, because I quite literally at one point had looked down and then I saw the little eclipse shadows, and it just that was probably one of the most fascinating pieces of the whole experience. I just thought that was so cool. I took I don't know how many pictures of those things, man, but that was really neat for me to see that in real life.
Yeah, seeing the moon walk across the sun was pretty spectacular with appropriate eye protection, I will note, and please wear sunglasses for the total eclipse as well. But the thing that's 2 things that struck me as the moon moved across the sun, everything got deadly quiet and still. It just seemed like back then we lived off Goat Creek Road, and there weren't even any cars on Goat Creek. Everything, the birds weren't chirping, there were no animals. It was deadly still, and then the temperature started dropping, and you
Yeah.
could feel the temperature drop between 5 and 10 degrees as the moon moved across the sun. So, I'm looking forward to both of those experiences in totality this in 2 weeks.
Yeah. If we have clouds, I have been told that we would still get the dimming effect of the sun. So I think that even if we get the bummer of having clouds, I still think it'll be a great experience for all of us that are able to live in the path of totality. Some of the comments I've seen online too, where people discussing that they were jealous of those of us that live in the path of totality, and they said in from their perspective, we hit the celestial lottery just being able to live here. So the idea of just being able to sit in our home in a comfortable setting and experience that is just I'm really excited about it. Really looking forward to it.
I am as well, and I hope our listeners, if you're not from Kerrville, I hope you'll come to Kerrville. If you can't come to Kerrville, I'm sure it'll be on television, so check it out. But this is not the last episode. We're gonna do a final episode after the eclipse and talk about what we were experiencing. Any last thoughts, Andrew?
No, I'm looking forward to it. We'll keep our fingers crossed for clear skies.